Welcome to the Loins of History podcast, a podcast about connecting history to current events. My name is Jay, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host Colin. And this week, we're going to continue our series on U.S. and Chinese relations by talking about the Warlord Era. Our last episode was talking about, Sun Yatsen, what his relationship with the United States was. Now we're going to talk about, hey, this is the new Chinese Republic, and take that up to the Civil War period. So, Colin, what are our key takeaways for today?
Thanks, Jay. So the first key takeaway, this is kind of a repeat. I think we've already touched upon this, but it is important to understand. So the conflict that we see in this era of Chinese history was mostly internal versus external. Previous couple episodes, we've been talking about Western nations and the Opium Wars, Boxer Rebellion, all fighting and dominating the Qing dynasty. Well, here we're going to have a lot of these, with Yuan Shi-Kai and the Beijing army, warlords, nationalists versus the communists. It's going to be a lot of internal fighting. A lot of that was because, looking through this, it seems like succession was a huge issue. Once the Republic of China was founded, who was going to be president? What was going to happen when Yuan Shi-Kai, who took over through military force, what was going to happen when he died? And that led to a lot of chaos. For number two, political power was really determined by who controlled the military. This is like a common theme throughout history. Just because you had the nominal authority on paper, unless you had a military to back it up, especially in times like this. Yuan Shi-Kai was, as we'll see, just a strongman who was able to control the army. He wasn't necessarily the political genius or the ideologue that Sun Yatsen was, but he controlled an army and he held warlords in check. And we're going to see that theme come back with Chiang Kai-shek and even eventually Mao Zedong. In order to maintain political power in a time of crisis like this, you're really going to have the military backing. And then finally, if I was a history teacher, I would say this, stomp my foot, this is going to be on the test. This is really the key takeaway that's going to tie on kind of the whole U.S. and Chinese relations together. Though the conflict was primarily internal, there were external forces at work here. And the influence that we see from those external forces, it's not so much that they were exerting military control, it was that they were starting to influence the ideology of the Chinese revolutionaries. So this comes into play especially with the Soviets and Americans. So before most of this, it was the 8-nation alliance where you had Britain, France, Germany, Italy, all these other countries coming in and taking slices. Well, here now, those countries still have positions of trade and influence, but they've largely begun to focus on themselves, and they would still just utilize it to make money. But the Soviets saw the opportunity to influence Sun Yatsen and these other Chinese revolutionaries to get them to more align with them ideologically. Whereas in the U.S. was looking at China simply as a marketplace, whereas the Soviet Union saw them as a future ideological ally. The U.S. just saw it as a place to do business. And that place to do business was often filtered through the lens of what the Japanese were doing. The Japanese were one of the real external military threats to the Chinese, and they would force concessions upon the Chinese in this kind of weakened state. So the U.S., in order to protect their business interests, was really focused on Japan and how they kept the Japanese at bay versus how do we win over the Chinese and influence them. And we're going to see that's going to play out, and we'll have a thought exercise and a conversation on it, but how that affected the Chinese and U.S. relations that we're going to see today. That's a synopsis of what we're going to talk about, Jay.
No, that's really good, Colin. Thank you for those takeaways. Can you, just to get going here, tell us more about Yuan Shi-Kai and what was going on after he took over the government there in Beijing?
Yeah, so last week we talked about Sun Yatsen and his founding father role and becoming the first president of the Republic of China. Well, Yuan Shi-Kai did not like that Sun Yatsen was elected. As we said, this was kind of a hastily thrown together, well, not really hastily thrown together, it was planned, but it was very quick. And Yuan Shi-Kai had his eyes on power. And once Sun Yatsen was elected, Yuan Shi-Kai basically utilized his army, the Beijing army, who was loyal to him as a bargaining chip. And he went to Sun Yatsen and essentially told him that he wanted to be the president of China, and he arranged that he was going to become the president of China. He actually had other members of the Republic of China, other leaders assassinated, and it was very obviously him that did it. And Yuan Shi-Kai was the one who negotiated the abdication of Pu Yi, ending Imperial China. And so you have this period where he's elected president in 1912, the end of the Qing dynasty. And so for the next 3.5 years or so, he continued to consolidate power. And so when we mentioned with the Wu Chang uprising and the Xinhai revolution, all of these provinces broke away and then united behind Sun Yatsen. Well, they still had to deal with the massive size of China, and all of these provinces and different tribes, provinces, cities, villages, all of them were scattered about. So holding them together required Yuan Shi-Kai. Anyway, so Yuan Shi-Kai, as he's consolidating power over these warlords, utilizing his Beiyang army to force their compliance, because the provincial warlords and the size of China, with how large China was, they feared Yuan Shi-Kai more than they feared the Republic of China government. So he was able to hold them in check, and he began gaining so much power that he was attempting to declare himself emperor. Unfortunately for him, he overstepped his bounds just a little bit, and he started losing the favor of his generals, and his army, the Beiyang army, basically said, "You're not going to do this." So he had to end his imperial dreams of becoming emperor of China and reestablishing an imperial China. During this time, like I mentioned, the Japanese were forcing concessions on him, and he was having to negotiate. And so even though he had a large army behind him and internally he had a lot of power on the international scene, he still had to deal with Western powers having bits of China and trading ports, that he was still in these unequal treaties. The Japanese forced more concessions on him. And then he died in 1916, and that's what began the Warlord Era. Succession is a big deal, historically speaking, and looking at it through an American lens, when George Washington decided that he was going to only serve 2 terms as president, when, after the 2020 election, we hear, is there going to be a peaceful transition of power? It's because historically speaking, we understand that, especially for a new nation, this is a very delicate time. And if it's not done correctly, succession can become civil war and chaos and break apart a nation. If you look at the crisis of the 3rd century in Rome, you had an emperor would take over once Commodus. If you've ever seen Gladiator, Joaquin Phoenix, he's the bad guy. No, the Roman Republic was not restored after they carried, Russell Crowe heroically out of the Colosseum. That's not how it happened. Commodus was murdered, and then the guy after him was murdered, and then the Praetorian Guard auctioned it off to a guy who bought the throne, and then he was overthrown, and then it just became this succession of constant civil wars, which is sort of what we see in China. Yuan Shi-Kai, strongman, he dies. No one is able to take over that mantle. And so those provinces that he held together through fear and an army suddenly broke apart. And it's interesting if you look at this time, because China definitely, this is Colin's opinion, at this point, we're at 70 plus years of the 100 years of humiliation. They've had a rough go of things. They've had millions of people die. Their economy has been exploited and depressed. I think there was one estimate that half the population was unemployed. If you think about that, if you have a large population of young men who are not working, that is a powder keg for revolution, and not just revolution, but war. I think I mentioned that in one of the previous episodes with the Boxer Rebellion, kind of the same thing. You have a bunch of 20-year-old men, they aren't doing anything. They want to get wealthy because there's no money, inflation is bad, there's no centralized control. So they start falling into these different cliques and factions and under these warlords. So you had a couple different cliques that formed, like the Zili, the Anhui, and the Fengtian. And I apologize if I pronounce these incorrectly, but I'm doing my best here. And these different cliques, and these were mostly focused in the north, but there's some all over, they began fighting one another for control of different cities, like Beijing, for example. Even though nominally on paper, the Beiyang government, or the Beiyang army takes over and becomes the Beiyang government, it was officially the official recognized government of the Republic of China. So foreign governments were still doing business with, I say doing business, they were still doing business with this government. So they became wealthy due to trade and taxes off of foreign goods. So it became kind of a popular place. And so the Zili took it over, and then they were eventually thrown out by the Fengtian. So it's a very chaotic time. These 11 years or so, it's extremely chaotic. There's no real centralized control. There is on paper a Beijing government and the Republic of China, but in practice, there are different warlords who are controlling these different provinces, who are fighting one another in very bloody conflicts. Like the Zili Fangtian was a very bloody conflict, passing control of Beijing, a very important city at the time, in order to exploit that. And there were some provincial warlords who were benevolent in what they did. And they would eventually join the KMT and probably the CCP. But I think it's important for us to understand that like this is a period of absolute chaos.
Yeah, and these warlords were receiving foreign backing the entire time. The Japanese were, I think I remember reading something that they were providing weapons and military supplies to the Fengtian side of it, uh, only because the Russians had supported these other northern military cliques, and the Japanese and the Russians were still fighting
They
over
didn't like each other.
Manchuria. Yeah, they're trying to vie for influence over Manchuria specifically. So they were like supporting these. It's not accurate to quite call it a proxy war, but like, doing these
Which clique
different
best
things.
aligns with our goals? No, you're right. And so like that's kind of the within key takeaway number one. Most of the conflict was internal between these warlords, but kind of getting into the third key takeaway where there's this external influence. You mentioned it during the episode on the Boxer Rebellion. I remember it where, after the Boxer Rebellion, Western powers sort of looked at China and were like, this is a mess. We don't want to commit just armies and resources to go fight here. So that influence kind of shifts to a more, like you're saying, almost like a proxy war. Like we're going to support this warlord. We're going to support this faction, this party, this leader. This is who we're going to throw our support behind because we're going to get favorable trade, because they're going to ally with us and give us access. Like the Japanese really wanted control of Manchuria. So did the Russians as a border state. And we're going to see that influence grow more and more.
Right. And like, let's remember what foreign policy is dominant in the United States at this time. It was isolationism, right? If we remember, we were letting millions and millions of people die in Europe during World War One, and we didn't come in until like the 11th hour in 1917 because, generally speaking, U.S. foreign policy was isolationist. So if we weren't going to get involved in a European conflict, we sure as heck weren't going to get involved in a Chinese conflict where the Russians and the Japanese were already doing their thing, and the Brits and the French to a lesser extent. So the United States, I don't think we really, like, politically speaking, supported any one of these warlords any more than the other. Rather, there were these token economic business interests at the time.
Yeah, and so that's a really good point. We talked about it last week with dollar diplomacy. The U.S. viewed China, like I said, as a marketplace. How are we going to continue to do business? So they had what was called the open door policy that was their means of enforcing like a fair marketplace, if you will. So they said, hey, everybody's going to get access to China. There's 400 million people here. There's tons of resources. There's tons of land. Everybody's going to get access. And that's how we're going to keep each nation from gaining too much control and becoming too powerful. So they wanted to force an open door policy where anybody could come in and do business, because even though we are isolationist, and we talk about this in the episodes on political parties, like the Republicans were very dominant during this period from the Civil War really up until the Great Depression, with the exception of like Woodrow Wilson, who was in charge some during this period. But even then, it's like, okay, we want to provide our foreign policy is going to be driven by business, the dollar. We want to enforce this open door policy. And the only thing that really started pushing us toward intervention with actual military force at this point was the fact that Japan was starting to get too much control of China. They threatened the open door policy. It wasn't until the flow of dollars to the American market and some of these other Western countries was being threatened by the Japanese that the U.S. really looked at this as a place that they should get involved in militarily or even politically, really. Whereas the Russians saw China in this revolution, in this era of chaos. To quote Littlefinger from Game of Thrones, chaos is a ladder. And after the Bolshevik Revolution and the October Revolution in 1919, they wanted to export communism around the world. And China was absolutely a target. And it makes perfect sense. They border with Russia. They fought the Russians. Russians were involved in the Eight Nation Alliance. It kind of made sense for the Russians to look at China and be like, this is a place where we need to exert our influence. And they didn't invade with an army. They invaded with ideas.
So, Colin, we've talked about some of these warlords and how they were, generals under Yuan Shi-Kai and the Beijing army. But Sun Yatsen, who was not a military figure, he was able to maintain his power base down there in Guangzhou in the southern part of China. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about how he was able to stay in power, how he kind of came back, and how he founded the Kuomintang.
Yeah, that's a good, it just struck me as soon as you said that a better analogy to the death of Yuan Shi-Kai and what happened in the Warlord Era was really closer to like Alexander the Great dying, and all his generals basically just carving it up. Like, we're all just going to form our own little provinces in our countries, and like, you take Seleucia, you take this part of Anatolia that you take, and that's actually I think that's actually the more apt description. Like, Alexander dies, this figurehead, this warlord, boom, all his generals carve it up. Sun Yat-sen, under his kind of right-hand man, if you will, was Chiang Kai-shek, who was a military man. He controlled the military and the National Revolutionist Army. And so Sun Yat-sen, we didn't talk about it last week, but he actually had a lot of influence and backing from the Soviet Union. It's really kind of odd to think, because in most of Sun Yat-sen's life up to this point, he was very American and very Westernized. Growing up in Hawaii, becoming a Christian. And then suddenly the Soviets, after the Bolshevik Revolution, have a heavy influence on Sun Yat-sen, to the point that what they call the Comintern, the Communist International, was basically these congresses where they would meet together, these communists around the world, and they would come with plans to spread communism around the world. Had a profound impact on him. And they were very excited at both with Sun Yat-sen, the prospect of him taking over China, and then Chiang Kai-shek once Sun Yat-sen passes away. The Soviets backed them. So it's kind of odd to think, like, I always in high school picture like the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek is like, oh, they were pro-Western, pro-capitalist. Not at all. Sun Yat-sen had three principles of the people called nationalism, democracy, and the livelihood of the people. Like you said, he set up his rival government. And if you go through some of the readings of the things that Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang pushed, they actually believed in the nationalization of industry. That's how they were going to retake power, and they were going to provide a social welfare for people by taking basically everyone's wealth and redistributing it. And that's going to create a social safety net. And he was pretty popular. Chiang Kai-shek leveraged the power of the Nationalist Revolutionary Army, and they started fighting these warlords. So in the early 1920s, they started pushing back, and then they began what was called the Northern Expedition. Sun Yat-sen passes away in 1925. And so then you have Chiang Kai-shek who takes over. And this Northern Expedition is really where the KMT and what later becomes the CCP, the left wing, they start to fracture. Within the Northern Expedition, so the Guangzhou is in the south of China. Beijing is in the north. And in the north of China, it was obviously broken up into these different cliques that we mentioned earlier with control of Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek, and before Sun Yat-sen died, they recognized that in order to unify China, they needed to take the north in Beijing. Beijing was the ultimate goal. So they came up with a plan for a northern expedition that lasted from about 1926 to 1928. And so within this northern expedition, it was 3 years of continuous fighting and defeating each of these different warlords and consolidating power. And so within this, the KMT, which is the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, you had a wing that was the communist wing, were really left wing at first. And it was actually the CCP, which is interesting to think about. Again, like I said, I always thought that the CCP was kind of its own party that was formed and then began fighting the nationalists for control. And it was an ideological difference, when in reality, they're almost the same. And it was more of a power grab. And who's...
No, I was just going to say, we think that we know the CCP and the Kuomintang like fought each other, so they must be ideological opposites, and they absolutely were not. As a matter of fact, they probably, ideologically speaking, had more in common than they were different, even though the KMT wasn't officially a communist party, and I don't believe was ever officially part of the Comintern. But to your point, like, nationalizing the means of production, pretty sure that makes you a commie.
Redistributing wealth. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, without calling you yourself a communist. So, they are not ideological opposites. It's more of a realpolitik. Like, these are just competitors for power, not ideological, enemies.
Yeah, and so to your point, like Sun Yatsen, so within this Comintern, there was in Moscow a Sun Yatsen University where they trained revolutionaries in the Soviet Union and sent them back to China in order to gain power and influence and teach them communism, and it wasn't just like, hey, here's what communism is. Like, hey, here's our communist ideals. Here's how you can take control of the government. Here's how you start a revolution and win a revolution based on what we did in 1917 and then later 1919. Chiang Kai-shek, and some of the other things, he was like, he actually fought. So he was I don't know, I want to say like a headmaster, but he was in charge of a military school, and in Canton, which was a very like westernized city and had a lot of international trade, like he actually fought a merchant army, and this is kind of where he gained some of his notoriety. He actually fought a merchant army and took it over, and then they went through and like he targeted these millionaires and very wealthy Chinese who had gained their wealth through trade with the Western countries. He like confiscated all of it. A bunch of people died in this ensuing conflict, and the Kuomintang were blaming different factions. And they said, well, it was actually the Beijing that did it. And anyway, he was still seizing, like he absolutely targeted wealthy landowners and people who had become pro-Japanese. He targeted them and took all their stuff. So, and he even had like land reforms that he championed where he, tried to create social progress so that everything would have this equitable use. And the only thing that really differentiated him ideologically from the communists was the fact that he didn't so much see it as a class struggle. That was like the one thing, like one of the fundamental tenets of communism is like, there's this, like we need to seize the means of production as this class struggle. He didn't really buy into that, nor did he champion that. And so that was like one of the big ideological differences. But I digress. Back to the Northern Expedition and where the communists split. So like the communists were part of the KMT. The KMT realized that they had to move north and begin defeating these warlords and the remnants of the Beijing army and government in order to take over and unify China. Well, the Communist Party, which was founded in 1921 by Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao, was part of this. And like Jay, you were saying, it's just kind of this realpolitik. The communists began gaining a lot of power. So they had someone named Mikhail Borodin, who was this liaison between the CCP and the Soviets. It's kind of an interesting guy. He was a lifelong, not lifelong, but for most of his life, he was a communist. He actually spent some time in the United States. He went to school here, I think at Valparaiso, if I'm not mistaken. Studied, like, was a pro-communist in like Chicago, and then he moved back to Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution and began working his way up through the Communist Party. But he began working with the CCP and like instructing them on how they can gain control. And the CCP began to grow dramatically. The message really resonated with the lower class and the peasants who had been disaffected by decades of poor Qing dynasty rule, and now the Republic of China and all these strongmen coming in these Western nations. So it really resonated with them, and they grew very large. So in 1927, there was the Shanghai Massacre. So, looking at this through a lens of a power grab, Chiang Kai-shek basically ordered the massacre and arrest of the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the numbers that I saw was, of the 60,000 or so Chinese communists who had been fighting with the Kuomintang in this northern expedition to reunify China, were killed. So they went from 60,000 to 10,000. That is a dramatic, almost wiped them out.
I would love to see a movie on this. Like the idea of like, hey, the KMT and the communists, the CCP getting along, everything's hunky dory. And then just this savage betrayal of, oh, you're now like the biggest threat to my power now that we've successfully kind of taken out everybody else. I'm going to do this, Brutus moment and just totally betray you, like, and then this starts a war and blah blah blah. Oh man, that'd make a great movie.
You're right, it would. I mean, and kind of into the key takeaway number 2 about the military power, like dictating your political power. Chiang Kai-shek, there were times where he was on paper not necessarily the ruler, but because he controlled the military and the army, he absolutely had the power. And so he perceived the communists, because they were growing, as a threat. So he utilized that military power to try and crush the CCP. Unfortunately, he did not purge the entire Communist Party. But at this point, the communists leave the KMT and form their own party. So it becomes officially the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. So they have separated in 1927 after the Shanghai Massacre. In June of 1928, Beijing ends up falling to the KMT and the Nationalist Revolutionary Army. And so this ends the Beiyang government. And so the nationalists have come to power. And he begins to further consolidate his own power within China at this point. And the CCP was relegated to kind of this sporadic gathering of different geographic locations, primarily in the south and west of China. Like we mentioned, that there's some definite foreign influence on this era of Chinese history, with the Soviets backing everyone from Sun Yatsen to Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, the Japanese forcing concessions and trying to influence different warlords. It's interesting because the Germans actually start getting involved with the nationalists in Chiang Kai-shek. So it becomes kind of a free-for-all for influence. But like we mentioned, the U.S. was looking at this as a place of business versus a place of politics. And I think it's kind of an interesting thought exercise, and maybe one we should do, so the Soviets were obviously very invested. They were trying to win the revolution. Should the Americans have been more involved in the Warlord era to try and influence some of these leaders to take a more pro-Western or pro-democratic stance? Because Sun Yat-sen, one of his tenets was democracy, but as we see, it was get me elected and then we're going to enact socialist policies.
Yeah, his definition of democracy would probably be closer to the current day North Korean definition of democracy. They are, in fact, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So, democracy is this very not ambiguous, but it's a term that can be shaped to mean what you want it to mean. Literally it just means people rule. So, how the people rule can be blurry. So that can be a liberal democratic or a socialist democratic type way. But on the question of what was the U.S. doing during this time and like what should the US have been doing during this time is is it's a good question because one of the main reasons why we're doing this entire series on US Chinese relations is to understand like I almost feel like a mediator between the government of China and the government of the United States in a sense like uh it's like hey guys the like China I know you've been hurt.
It's
like,
literally a century of humiliation.
yeah, like I know it's not been fun, and that is a gross understatement. Um, Not only that, but a lot of your ex girlfriends have abused you, cheated on you. Like, there's a lot of trauma there, and rightfully so. But America is a good girl. like, don't be. America's unlike these other girls for these reasons. Like, we talked about it during like the Opium Wars and the Box Rebellion. Uh, the United States is not and has never been this colonizing European power. In the same way, during this period, the United States was not like we didn't have designs on Taiwan. We didn't have designs on Manchuria. Rather, what U.S. interests are is we want to create a better society internally first, and then to help other countries as well. The way in which you create a better society, a large part of that is building wealth, like with technological advancements, with an economic system that allows those technological advancements, to be proliferated to other people. Let's not forget, and when I say technological advancements, I don't necessarily mean an iPhone. I mean like the grocery store, right? Like that was a technological advancement during, you know, slightly before this time period, like in the 1800s. Like the whole concept of groceries is relatively new.
Well, imagine all the
And
technology you need to make the supply chain work to have a grocery store function.
right, right. Like in the United States, like we we first and foremost just want to make life easier for Americans. Building wealth is a part of that. Access to foreign markets is a part of that. So, um, I say all that to say, during this time period, we, when Yuan Shi-Kai took over, we never recognized Sun Yatsen. We were like, the legitimate government of China is the Qing. It's the Qing. It's the Qing. Oh, now it's Yuan Shi-Kai. Like,
And the Beijing
and we
government
did.
was recognized. We recognized the Beijing government.
Yes. Yes. And we did that because we did not want to get involved in the power politics of China because one, it's super messy. Two, just from an ideological standpoint, we don't believe it's our role to do that. And I know that kind of sounds funny because later on throughout the Cold War, we were involved in other people's political processes like crazy. And it's fun. Honestly, it's kind of fun to talk through why that happened. But without going down that rabbit trail and trying to stay focused on the current one, during the Warlord era, the the United States just wanted a an economic relationship with all of China and a philanthropic relationships. Like the missionaries didn't just go away. Um, there were still efforts to spread religion, Christianity during this time,
There was
albeit.
there
Go
was
ahead.
one warlord. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but when I was reading through this, that he was one of the more benevolent warlords who tried to enact. He got rid of foot binding and some of these other policies that were kind of considered backwards and that were still happening. But like he wanted to baptize like his entire. So he would go to like a village or whatever that he would take over and try and baptize everyone and then get rid of foot binding and really work toward the good. So yeah, you're right. And he was influenced by Christian missionaries. So yeah, you're right that
Yeah.
we're at 80 years plus since the first missionaries start going into China, and they're still having an effect.
Yeah. So like what I would say to Xi Jinping, if I could, and I don't know if he actually thinks this way. I don't know.
But
I'm
he is
speaking
listening to the
to.
podcast, so go ahead.
uh, that's frightening. Anyway, um, it would say like, hey man, you're like average, better yet, average Chinese citizen in Shanghai. Um, your century humiliation was not our fault. Our being the United States in particular. Um, therefore, don't think of like do you don't think of the United States as public enemy number one. Conversely, to Americans listening to this podcast, right? Because y'all are actually listening. I don't know of any Chinese people listening. Uh, you know, China has reasons for being anti-Western, and understandably so. It's very difficult to be anti-Western and not lump the United States into that. But their number one priority is the same as ours. It's to create a better society within their country. All these different warlords and the CCP, yes, there were power plays, but as Xi Jinping is finding out right now, you cannot lose the support of the people. You can make all the power plays you want, but you have to do it in such a way that keeps the support of the people. So these warlords, like they all had these different social reforms. Like currency reform was huge during this time, and all these different warlords had different currencies going on because they were trying to fix the economic system. They were, and so I say all that to say, um, from a from an American perspective, China is chaos during this time. They are trying to fight off foreign powers. We haven't even got to the Japanese war and what they did to China during this time. Um, they're trying to fight off all these foreign influences. They just want peace and stability. And currently, the CCP has given China the longest peace, the longest stability. And I realize there's a huge asterisk there. Like there was the Cultural Revolution, there was the Great Leap Forward. Like tens of millions of people have died in China at the hands of the CCP. Please, like I'm not trying to be an advocate for the CCP. However, if you're average Joe Blow in Shanghai, China, relatively speaking, the CCP has created stability prior to the 100 years prior to that. That's how bad it was in China
I
before that.
agree.
So we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, with the Cultural Revolution, I think there's estimates as up to 60 million people died. But I hate to say it like this, but like that's almost par for the course for the Chinese. If you look at like the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, all of these other wars, the Opium Wars that they fought, the Sino-Russian War, the
Yeah.
Japanese invading and war, like you're right, it's almost par for the course, and I almost want to say that's just a big asterisk in a long line of stability.
Right. I mean, we talk about how since 1949, in terms of conventional conflicts, China's only had one, and it was a complete debacle in Vietnam. So, relatively speaking, like the CCP.
What about Korea?
Oh, okay. No, you're right. You're right. I say Korea, like, yeah, that was a conventional conflict, but that was 1 year after they had kind of consolidated the entire country. So, like, okay, sure. So maybe from 1952 to the present, they have only had one conventional conflict. So, like, whereas in the United States, like we have been in so many different conventional conflicts since the exact same time period. I mean, heck, we were in Vietnam, we were in Korea, we were in Iraq, we were in Afghanistan, we were have done various things throughout, Central and South America. Like we have been nonstop conflict from a certain perspective, whereas China has, from an external standpoint, they haven't, save that one, debacle foray into Vietnam.
I look back on it and I think the U.S. So one of the things, and we'll get into this kind of more next week when we start talking about like the Civil War that China fought and then the United Front against Japan in World War II. But one of the things that really upset both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong and I say that just to say like really the Chinese in general, was the unequal treaties. And now that they were getting themselves into a position to quote unquote renegotiate those, I think the U.S. should have been more proactive with initially the Republic of China and the Beijing government, but then finding someone like Chiang Kai-shek, even though he did not necessarily espouse Western ideas on capitalism and things like that, extending an olive branch and saying like, hey, we're going to renegotiate these treaties as equals would have gone a lot further than quote unquote backing him during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War through World War II and up until 1949, when we had to help, when they evacuated to Taiwan, I think that would have gone a lot further to help them rally support around Chiang Kai-shek and finding ways to bring in the fold and gain support amongst the people of China. I think that would have helped a lot because the Soviets absolutely used those unequal treaties to say, hey, look at what those imperialists did to you. Look at what those capitalists did to you. And they were able to win I think this term is overused, but win the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. And that the CCP was able to use that to grow, and they grew dramatically. And eventually, we'll see. Eventually, they were able. Chiang Kai-shek lost the support of the people. He lost the mandate of heaven, if you will. Even though that kind of went away with Imperial China, but
yeah, and this is somewhat jumping ahead to a future episode, but it's if you were to just take two snapshots of China, like I'm thinking of looking at a map, seeing who controls what. After the Shanghai massacre, the Kuomintang controlled nearly all of what we think of today as China. They didn't control Mongolia. They didn't control. They kind of controlled Manchuria, but like the CCP did not control a whole lot. This is right before the Long March. If you take a snapshot of that, then fast forward to 1948, and the CCP controls nearly all of China. Like it's kind of flip-flopped, right?
Right.
The CCP controls nearly all of China, and the KMT is very much on the retreat. And if you were to look at those two maps side by side, the question is how on earth did that happen, right? It was like, it's almost like the Atlanta Falcons losing to the Patriots in the Super Bowl. It's like you just blew a huge lead. How on earth did that happen? Well, World War II happened, but it was during the actions of World War II, to your point, Colin, the KMT squandered their lead in public support, and the communists and Mao was all about it. Like even his method of warfighting was like get the support of the people, fight amongst the people. Like Mao was hyper focused on the people themselves, and not from like here in the United States, we kind of talk about like we the people, like, and yes, that's true. But I think a lot of times we pay lip service to the fact that people stay in power through the support of average, normal people. And if you start doing things to piss those people off, your power goes away. Like it is nearly impossible to maintain power.
I'm going to throw an asterisk on key takeaway number 2, where I said that political power is dictated by military power. I think we should look at that through the lens of who makes up the military and who is going to support the military. It's the people. And so you can't win a military campaign without people to join and support your military.
Bro, you've nailed it. And let's look at why was the Wu Chang uprising? I don't remember if we discussed this in detail or not, but why was all of a sudden, like the umpteenth uprising that had occurred, why was it all of a sudden successful in overthrowing the Qing? One of the key factors that made that one successful was the members of the Qing military either chose to not put down the rebellion or they joined it themselves.
Yuan Shi-Kai.
So when the military itself kind of goes, we don't support, and the military is not going to do that because they also are, citizens, people, like they belong to the people, right? So, like Yuan Shi-Kai, like if you don't maintain support of the people, it doesn't matter how strong your military is. The military is also not going to back you up.
Well, that's the thing. Your military is not going to be strong. It's not going to have people to join it, people to fight.
Yeah. This popped in my head, and this is probably an unhelpful rabbit hole, but just thinking about Russia right now, like I don't think we have a good grasp at how unstable the Russian government is right now because the political implications of the drastic weakening of their military, right? Like, Russia has a similar thing going on in China in that you're not allowed to publicly talk bad about the government. It's kind of a police state, and the military are behind that. Well, like Russia's military has thrown itself into the meat grinder of the Ukraine. It's severely weakened. Only as time goes on, like there's a direct correlation between the weakening of your military and the stability of your government. So, if everything that we're saying is true about China, and you can maintain power by strength of your military, and you have a strong military by support of the people, what's going to happen in Russia when the military is significantly weakened? The people start questioning you, so on and so forth. Interesting thought to me. All right. I think that's a good stopping point for this episode, Colin. Thank you for educating us on the Warlord Era and the external influences, the Russians, the Japanese, the Americans during this time. I really enjoyed listening to that, and I hope our listeners did too. If you did, please give us a review, 5 stars, of course. But if you have any constructive feedback, we are totally willing to hear that as well. You can help make this podcast a lot better by doing that. The best way to do that is by reaching out to us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all variations of Loins of History. So if you just search Loins of History, you can find us. There'll also be links here in the show notes. Give us some feedback. If you really like what we're doing and want to support this podcast with a gift, you can, if you're listening on Anchor, you can click that support button, or there's a link to our Patreon page in the show notes. Lastly, just want to give a huge thank you to our listeners. Our last review on Apple, big shout out to user Proletarians Unite.
He's going to enjoy the next episode.
Oh man, yeah. Proletarians Unite. Super. You said you were stoked for listening to the US-China one, so hopefully you hear this soon. Thanks for the 5-star review, man. Thank you for the great review. Super appreciate that. If you've noticed, Colin and I, when we see a 5-star review, we'll give you a shout out here at the end of the episode. So send us those reviews, and if you got an awesome username like Proletarians Unite, we'll give you a shout out. So
stay tuned for the next episode.
Yeah, stay tuned. Hey, thanks seriously to all of our listeners. Really appreciate y'all listening to us this far. It's not lost on us. And we really hope to join in the conversation with y'all on social media. And with that, thank you. And this has been the Loins of History.